In this video, we discuss CCUS and why, despite being heralded as a significant part of the transition to net zero, very little is actually being built. If you'd like to download our latest report, you can click on the QR code on screen now. The video will include a 10 to 12 minute presentation given by Lorenzo Sani, lead author and analyst in the Power and Utilities team, before we go into a Q&A session. The approximate length of the video is about 45 to 60 minutes, depending upon the number of questions. My name is Piotr, and I'm part of the Communications and Events team. Carbon Tracker is a not-for-profit financial think tank. Our vision is a fully decarbonized global economy well before 2050. All our research converts climate science into financial risk and reward, with the aim to accelerate the energy transition away from fossil fuels by mobilizing the financial markets. Our work, including this report, are all available on the website for free to download and access, available at www.carbontracker.org. And as you can see, other platforms, third party, as well as the YouTube channel, of which we encourage you to subscribe to for future content and updates. Joining Lorenzo today are three distinguished experts. Olivia Powys, UK Director for the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, where she works on developing the UK strategy and work programme of the association. Prior to CCSA, Olivia was at the National Infrastructure Commission. Second is Carl Greenfield. He is an energy analyst at the IEA. He leads the policy and engagement work on the carbon capture, utilisation and storage team. Prior to joining the IEA, Carl served as a director of energy and environment at a policy consulting firm in Washington, D.C. And third is Carl Smith, director of external affairs and strategic policy at Infinium. He leads Infinium's engagement and communication with the government, regulators, and value chain partners. Prior to that, Carl was group head of bioenergy CCUS strategy engagement, as well as policy and government relations at Drax Corp plc. But now, over to Lorenzo.
My name is Lorenzo Sani. I'm an analyst in Carbon Tracker's Power and Utilities team. And today I'm very excited to introduce you to the findings of our recent report, whose titled Curb Your Enthusiasm, Bridging the Gap Between the UK's CCUS Target and Reality. So in a very condensed form, the aim of this report is to explore what's the role of CCUS in the UK's transition to net zero. And in the coming slides, I'll try to answer this question by presenting on the global challenge, then focusing on the UK CCUS strategy. Next, I'll present the results of our risk assessment, and I will follow with an analysis of the role of carbon markets and conclude on the need for a new target. So here is the acronym. I think you will know it, but just to be sure, CCUS stands for Carbon Capture, Utilisation and Storage. Now, starting with the global challenge. So most of the global energy transition models, be it IEA, IPCC, agree that CCUS is a key tool in net zero scenarios. So according to the IEA's net zero scenario, CCUS should account for 8% of emission reduction by 2050 in its net zero emission scenario. And achieving this target is very ambitious, and it will require a very massive scale up of the technology from the 50 million tons of CO2 that we have today, ramping up by 2030 to 1,000, so from 50 to 1,000 by 2030, and up to 6,000 by 2050. And you see it in this chart on the red dashed line. And this is very ambitious, and we see there are already two worrying signs on the industry's ability to deliver on this. So first of all, the IEA in the last couple of years already reduced its potential outlook for CCUS by 30%. And we see it in the comparison between the dark gray line and the red line. And secondly, what's more worrying is the amount of projects in the pipeline, which is represented by this green line in the chart, is still far below what will be needed by 2030. So we have a very large ambition gap. And the big question is, will the industry be able to to scale up, or should we update the models one more? Then, if we move to the UK, so the UK has got a long history with CCUS. The first program started almost 20 years ago. However, to date, we still don't have any project on the ground. Now, today, the UK has got an ambitious target of becoming a global leader in CCUS. It has set a clear ambition in terms of target and future targets. So the initial step will require creating and kickstarting a CCUS market in the 2030s. With a target of achieving at least 50 million tons of carbon captured by 2035, which again, 50 is more or less the installed global capacity today. So this is quite an ambitious target for the UK only. And the long-term vision is to create a self-sustaining market where no government subsidies will be needed anymore. And if we move on the next slide, we like to see how the UK is planning to achieve this. So first of all, we need to consider that the UK has got a very important geographical advantage. So how you can see in this map, around 70% of industrial emissions in the country are concentrated in only 7 industrial clusters. So this is a great advantage in terms of aggregating different point of emissions in a few sites. And the second great advantage is that the UK has got access to large undersea storage sites in depleted oil and gas fields in the UK's continental shelf. So if we bring these two factors together, UK is very well positioned to launch a CCUS industry, and the government has set aside 20 billions of taxpayer funding to kickstart the CCUS industry, and is trying to play a role between de-risking project and coordinating the delivery of capture project and transmission and infrastructure, and the infrastructure for transporting and storing carbon. So the UK is currently focusing on accelerating projects via 2 tracks where it's selected for CCUS clusters, and is currently prioritizing 8 projects in the first track, where these projects are located in the cement industry, hydrogen, gas power with CCUS, and energy from waste. So in the next section, we'll present our risk assessment of deploying CCUS in these 5 sectors, so cement, steel, hydrogen, bioenergy with CCS or BECCS, and gas power with CCS. So we looked at 3 key parameters, so delivery risk, stranded asset risk, and cost premium. And in the coming section, I'll try to give you a snapshot of what we found in our analysis, but of course, I won't be able to explain you all the details of our analysis, so I'll try to limit to 1 key message per technology, but I warmly encourage you to explore the whole report if you want to find more about all the nuances of deploying CCUS in each sector in the UK. So first of all, I want to start with cement. In short, the main message is that we haven't found any credible alternative to decarbonize the UK cement sector without CCUS. And so the cement industry accounts for about 2% of the British CO2 emissions. And what is very important is that about 60% of these emissions, of the emission produced in the cement production process, cannot be removed without CCUS. So they cannot be removed with renewables or energy efficiency or so on, because they're inherent in the process of producing cement. And so this is why we believe CCUS is a very important solution for this sector, but there are some very important challenges. The main one that we found is that there isn't yet any commercial project in the world operating at commercial scale on a cement plant. However, the first one is currently under construction in Norway and is expected to come online. So we hope that with this Norwegian project, we will learn enough on the complexity of the technology and the cost so that it can scale up and somewhere else. Then if we move to iron and steel, we see that the situation here is almost at the opposite end. So we don't believe CCUS is a suitable solution to abate emissions in the steel industry. And mostly because we found that a better alternative exists, and that's hydrogen-based steelmaking. So the main challenge here concern carbon emissions. So I'd like to focus on this chart for a moment. And here we represent what's the emission intensity of producing steel with different processes. And the ones circled in red are the ones that are based on CCS, while the one circled in green represent the emission of producing steel with low carbon hydrogen. And we see here that there is a very large gap between the emissions on CCS-based projects versus hydrogen. And another important factor is that the cost premium is estimated to be quite similar for both applications. So here we believe that the way forward for the iron and steel industry, especially in the UK and Europe, is to focus on the hydrogens. Then this allows me to move to the hydrogen sector, where we indeed believe there is an opportunity for CCUS. First of all, we believe that CCUS can help to decarbonize the current demand for hydrogen that today we have in the UK, so in the chemical industry, fertilizer, and refineries, which together accounts for about 2% of CO2 emissions. And secondly, CCUS-based hydrogen could play a role in kickstarting new uses of hydrogen as a fuel. So hydrogen that can be used to substitute fossil fuels in some hard-to-abate sectors, for example, heavy industry where high temperature heat is needed, long duration energy storage, steel sector, as I just mentioned, and a few others. And the key advantage here for CCUS is that in the medium term, we still see that blue hydrogen or CCUS-based hydrogen will be cost competitive and cheaper than hydrogen from green hydrogen from electricity. And this is very important because in the medium to short term, we believe this is the main competitive advantage for blue hydrogen, but we also see an important risk. So we see in the future a potential risk for market saturation that can lead to asset stranding for blue hydrogen plants. And this is because there is still a very large uncertainty on the future demand in hydrogen. There is an estimated range of future demand by 2035 for hydrogen between 2 to 6 million tons of hydrogen in the UK. So this is a quite large range, and depending on which side of the future projection we stand, there is a risk that the market could be saturated by green hydrogen demand and shortcoming in demand. So here we found an important risk for stranding in blue hydrogen plants. Then let's move to the power sector, and I want to start with bioenergy with CCS. So the UK's approach towards BECCS here is quite risky in our opinion, because it is heavily relying on the conversion of the Drax biomass power plant to CCS. Drax is the largest bioenergy plant in the world, and if converted to CCS, will be by far the largest CCS plant in the world. And with this scale, we believe arise a lot of challenges and risks. First of all, the investment needed for Drax will be massive, and the company will require lots of support to the government to go through the construction phase. Then biomass-based electricity is already at least 3 times more expensive than wind and solar, and it's 3 times more expensive than wind and solar without CCS. So with CCS, this cost will be even higher, and we see it in the chart here. And thus, this project will always necessarily need to rely on subsidies to be profitable. And we estimate, and it has been estimated that the subsidies could be in excess of 25 billion for a 15 years contract. So it could be a very costly and expensive contract. And finally, there are still many questions about the sustainability of the supply chain, of the wood pellets that will be needed for this power plant. And the size of the plant makes the certification of biomass even more complex than what it is today. So the last technology we mentioned is gas power with CCS, which is a very interesting application. So there is a strong future need for long duration flexibility in the power system. And this is for the classic days when the sun is not shining, the wind is not blowing, and we need a few days worth of flexible power generation. And this is where, so for example, what we see in this chart, and this is where gas CCS can play a role. However, we see that there are many alternative solutions that can provide this service. And with the increasing penetration of battery storage, flexibility solution, and the future prospect for hydrogen fire turbines, the role that gas CCS could play in the future might be much lower than what we see today. And there is a very significant risk for stranded assets if we overinvest in this technology, because the future need for this technology might be much lower than what we forecast today. And especially this becomes very important if the plants will be needed just for a few hours each year, because under short utilization hours, hydrogen power plants could be cheaper than gas CCS plants. And now we can start to draw some conclusions of what we found until now, which is that CCUS projects in the UK are still not viable on a business case, on a financial basis, and still need large government subsidies to be profitable. And let's say that this is fine in the short term, because a lot of these projects are first of a kind. So the technology still need to be proven and to ensure the bankability of the project. But in the medium term, we need to fix this so that the industry will not be relying on government subsidies, but on market profitability to be competitive. And in our opinion, the single most important measure to deliver a self-sustaining CCUS market in the UK is a strong carbon price. However, the carbon market today in the UK is really not working. Prices recently crashed to 30 to 40 pounds per ton of CO2, while these applications, to be profitable, will need prices in excess of 100 tons per CO2, and especially they will need quite a lot of certainty on future prices, low volatility, and high liquidity, which is more or less the opposite of what we see in the market today. Then one last thing before I finish is that I would like to show you what we found when we tried to understand why there was so much CCUS in the government transition plan. So we looked in the details at the assumption that were used to create the scenario used by the UK's government, which relies on the Climate Change Committee 6 carbon budget. And what we found is, in short, that the assumption that were used in this model underestimate the cost of carbon capture and storage in different sectors and are not reflective of what the real market conditions are. So we urgently recommend that these models are updated, and these updated models influence the strategy that the government takes towards CCUS, so that the 20 billion of funding can be targeted towards those technologies that really need CCUS and they have no alternatives. So finally, I'm coming to the conclusions. So what's the role for CCUS in the UK? Based on our analysis, we found that cement sectors has no alternative to decarbonize. Iron and steel, hydrogen can provide higher emission reductions, but at a similar cost. CCUS could kickstart hydrogen as a fuel, but there is a future risk of market saturation. Removals should be prioritized for low-risk applications, such as energy from waste, instead of very large bioenergy with BECCS plants. Then gas CCS might be needed for security of supply, but might also be outcompeted by hydrogen turbines, and it's not a future-proof technology. Then the UK's carbon market is not delivering the right signal, and a price in excess of 100 pounds per ton of CO2 is needed. And finally, that the UK CCUS targets are based on optimistic and outdated assumptions and should be updated to reflect the market reality. So, thanks everyone. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you found this presentation interesting. I tried to condense as much as possible in this short presentation, but again, you will find more details in the report. And now, without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen. I hope that you could see the panelists in the screen. I welcome, here they come. Thank you, Carl Greenfield, Carl Smith, and Olivia for joining us today. So I would like to start with Carl Greenfield with the first question. So during my analysis of the CCUS projects in operation today, I found that there is a constant trend of over promises and under delivery. And despite a long history, the CCUS industry has still struggled to deliver at scale what will be needed. So, in your work, do you see what are the key global developments that you see? Is this trend changing, and what can you tell us about what's happening on the world?
Sure, happy to, Lorenzo. And thanks, Lorenzo, Hannah, and the Carbon Tracker colleagues for inviting me to this panel. Yeah, I think you hit it on the head in terms of there's a lot of momentum. And so at the IEA, we publish a CCUS projects database, which tracks all projects around the world. We made this available for free starting last year. And last year, when we released this database, the project pipeline showed around 320 million tons of CO2 capture capacity by 2030 globally, and around 360 of storage capacity. This was a massive increase from the previous year. When we updated our database this past February, we saw very similar increases in 2023. We saw announced capture capacity, at least projected to 2030, increased by 35%, storage capacity by 70%. And so bringing the total amount of CO2 capture capacity by 2030 to over 430 million tons. And for storage, around 620 million tons of CO2 per year. Globally, this momentum has been driven by a number of different policies in a number of different regions. In the US, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the IRA. Project announcements nearly doubled between 2022 to 2023, and doubled again in the previous year. Before that, the IRA has boosted geologic storage. So if you look at storage capacity in the US by 2030, after the IRA was passed, these announcements tripled in capacity in the US, which is pretty huge to see. In Europe, you see policies at the country level in Denmark and Norway. In the UK, as you mentioned, Lorenzo, ongoing support from the European Commission. You see this start to generate a little bit of interest within Europe as well. And Germany is an interesting one. Germany made its reentry into CCUS. It released its carbon management strategy, plans to amend legislation to regulate CCUS activities, including offshore storage. Look to the other part of the world, Japan. It's quickly advancing its efforts. It selected 7 large-scale projects to capture and store around 13 million tons of CO2 per year by 2030. It's also drafting legislation to regulate CCS activities, and looking to amend the London Protocol to allow for the transboundary transportation and storage of CO2. So there's a lot of momentum, I would say. There's a lot of momentum in the form of project announcements. And we need this momentum to kind of continue if we want to reach our net zero goals. But there's still the other side of the equation is translating this momentum into financial investment decisions, which is a great marker to see when a project would start operation, and then eventually operation. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done between those two things.
Okay, excellent. And thanks for sharing an update also on these numbers. I think it's very useful for the audience. And just a quick follow-up, I would like to ask you, it seems there is a positive momentum. More projects are coming in the pipeline, but there is still quite a large gap between what the net zero emission scenario tells us we need and what the pipeline is, where the pipeline is going. So how do you see this gap evolving, and what else will be needed to close the gap, or what other technologies will be needed in case CCUS doesn't scale up fast enough?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so towards the beginning of last year, we had around 45 million tons of CO2 capture capacity. This year it's 50 million tons. So the operational capacity is not growing at the same rate as the project announcements are. That's for sure. And in our net zero scenario, by 2030, at least in our scenario, we call for around 1 billion tons of CO2 captured and stored each year by 2030. So as you point out, 20 times of what we have today. So project announcements are just one part of this puzzle to reach that gigaton scale. What needs to happen is that a greater percentage of projects need to reach FID, essentially. And so last year we had around 10 capture facilities enter into operation. Around 20 projects reach FID. But these projects or capacity that's out there in operation or reaching FID, still around 20% of total announced capture capacity for 2030. For storage, it's even lower. So these percentages haven't really increased since the previous year. So we need more projects to reach FID. And we also need to see greater ambition in other sectors. And so this is globally, and particularly within industry. And so, Lorenzo, you mentioned cement. It's one of those fairly hard to decarbonize sectors. There's not many technologically available options to decarbonize cement, and 60% of the emissions is process emissions, where you can't do anything but capture those CO2 emissions. We need more of a focus on that globally. If you look at the pipeline at current industry as a whole, not just cement, but industry accounts for around 10% of announced capacity by 2030. In our net zero scenario, this needs to reach around a quarter of all CO2 captured by 2030. So we need a greater focus on industry. We need projects to reach FID. And we also, the other part of this puzzle is we need to reduce the time it takes to actually build projects. And for projects to come into operation, we're in 2024. At the IEA, we have these 2030, 2035, 2050 milestones. But it takes on average 6 years to build a CCUS project. We need to decrease this time because we're running out of time. So we need to decrease the amount of time it takes to build a project. We also still need to ensure that environmental and social safeguards in place that our permitting regimes have. But we just need to be a little bit more efficient.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you definitely gave us a lot of food for thought with this. And this allows me also to introduce Olivia, who's the UK director at the CCSA. And I would like now to move from the global to the UK's focus. So yes, first of all, do you think the government targets are set towards the right direction? And is there enough funding to support the government's ambition?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to the webinar today. I think it's important to set out at the outset, we read the report with interest, and there are some elements where we clearly align there in terms of the critical role for cement and waste for energy and removals and a stable carbon price. There are also areas where we didn't align, and I think in terms of recommendations for government targets to scale back and be revised. I think this is where the government targets are based on independent advice from the CCC, and that's continually updated. And there has been significant progress in the UK. We have clear ambitions set from the government in terms of those targets of 20 to 30 million tonnes by 2030 and rising to 50 to 60 by 2035. And the cluster sequencing programme, so that direction from government in terms of the approach to take there, has really helped to move the industry forwards and remove some of the risk that was previously perceived to be in CCUS in terms of the risk either sitting with the transport and storage or with the emitters. So the approach that the government's taken sort of right across the supply chain, from the economic model, the business models, and some of the protections that are in there, such as the government support package, I think have really helped to the UK strategy in terms of moving forward and to make sure that infrastructure is built, and then emitters can then connect to that and share the cost of that infrastructure. That's to say it's not without its challenges. And I think, the legislative and the regulatory framework that we have set up with industry and government in the UK is well respected and considered world leading by some, but we've got to now move from where we are in terms of having this towards the projects actually deploying. And the CCSA found in our delivery plan, the first delivery plan we did in 2022, that there's a huge pipeline of projects looking to deploy CCUS that amounted to about 70 million tonnes per year. And then that went up by a third when we did a delivery plan in 2023, up to about 94 million tonnes per year. So the challenge, I think, in terms of, you're saying, should the government reassess the targets? no, because we know there's so much more that that needs to be. We would only sort of suggest in one way that they would need to go up. We know that there is so much potential in the UK, and that we have the potential storage there as well. So I think in terms of where the government's now going, it's to the key things are that we need to reach final investment decisions for those first projects, and to have a clear framework in terms of moving forward for all the other projects that need to move forward, so that there's a clear route to deployment there, so a clear allocation framework moving forward. And critically, in terms of, Carl touched on where Europe's going and the progress that's been made there, we have huge storage potential in the UK, and we need to be able to open up and export that storage potential. And so some of that is around regulatory barriers, an aligned emissions trading scheme, CBAM, to help do that, but also making progress on elements like non-pipeline transport. So I think, and then you asked about money. Yes, there is an initial allocation in the budget from last year of 20 billion for early deployment of CCS, and so yes, that will kickstart the market and move forward with those first projects. But we also need to then have more certainty in terms of that longer term framework, so that we can deploy all the other projects and move forward at scale.
Okay, thank you so much. And I see we don't necessarily agree on the target, on the final target, but we definitely both see, and together with what Carl said, that there is most of the priority now should be on getting the initial projects on the ground and start getting the first final investment decision and basically get people building. And what do you see in this regard? So the first track 1 projects are supposed to come online mid-2020s towards 2030. And how do you see we're progressing there? And also, what's still deterring investors to do the final decision?
In terms of those track 1 projects, and I think now it's generally sort of understood we're hoping to move towards they're hoping to move towards final investment decisions in around September, and I think good progress is being made for this year. It's obviously been delayed in years. Last year there was good progress. I think the year before, delays, and this was largely external, sort of political, very difficult to move decisions through at that point. So but really there has been good progress now, and I think we're expecting those projects to move forward. And I think in terms of other, how investor confidence is there. I think we've recently run round tables with investors on each of the business models, so that they can really understand them and get to grips with them. But this model is based on concepts that are well understood by investors, based on sort of contract for difference and a regulated model, which is well understood from them. I think the biggest thing that will help increase investor confidence is to know that the industry will deploy at scale, and so that if they're going to pivot their teams to really understand these business models and spend time and money investing in CCUS, they need to know that it'll move beyond the first few projects, and that there will really be a large scale industry there for investors deploying. But I think things are now really moving forward, and we are seeing pace within the industry.
Okay, thank you so much. That looks promising. And now I'd like to move from UK focus to specific project focus with Carl Smith. So Carl's work at Infinium, which is planning to invest, if I'm not wrong, around 1 billion in the coming years to install CCUS on energy from waste facilities. So first of all, Carl, very briefly, what's the advantage in energy from waste projects? Why are they low regret? And maybe if you see other low regret options in the market.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo. And again, similarly, thank you for inviting me today. So if we look at the UK, there's around 50 energy from waste facilities operating around the country today. If you look globally, there's over 2,500 facilities. So taking a macro level, these are very common facilities. Their primary purpose at the moment is to send unrecyclable waste away from climate-damaging landfill and use it to turn into energy. So that's the primary purpose today. But obviously in doing that, they do create CO2 as well. So if we look at the 50 facilities I mentioned in the UK, around 20 million tons is generated from those facilities currently. So it's clear that as we go forward in time, society will continue to produce a quantum of unrecyclable waste, and we will need those facilities, but those facilities will need to decarbonize for a sustainable net zero trajectory. And we think, as reflected in your report, number one, carbon capture and storage technology is the only technology available today to do that. But also number two, we think that of the options and different technologies and applications of CCS, energy from waste is a particularly good application and low regrets, as you described in the report. And why is that? So I'd like to focus on three characteristics of energy from waste that make it particularly suitable for CCS. So number one is around 50% of the waste that comes to an energy from waste facility in the UK is of fossil origin, like plastic bottles, and 50% is biogenic from things like food waste. So that means today we're currently generating 50% fossil CO2 and 50% biogenic CO2. Now, if we install CCS on a facility, you capture 90 to 95% of the fossil CO2, so you don't add it to the atmosphere. We're also capturing 90 to 95% of the biogenic CO2, which is a carbon removal from the atmosphere. So that when we think about the net and net zero and how the UK and other countries meet their net zero targets by 2050, carbon removals is a key component of that. I think there is broad consensus around that. And energy from waste facilities can make a significant contribution to that goal. And number two, energy from waste facilities typically operate in a baseload profile. So they provide steady streams of CO2 when installed with CCS to CCS networks. That's very helpful. And number three, energy from waste facilities, as the name suggests, create energy. So whether that's electricity or heat. Therefore, if we put CCS on those facilities and we take the biogenic element into consideration, we would be producing carbon negative electricity or carbon negative heat. So again, there's multiple co-benefits that are generated by energy from waste facilities with CCS aside from emissions reduction.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks so much. And I think my next question for you will be, so at Infinium, you're trying to develop these projects and you're currently not into the track 1, track 2 acceleration programs from the government. So there is more also of a merchant angle there. And I would like to ask you, are we there yet in the UK so that some projects can start to be considered on a merchant basis, so without strong subsidies? And if we're not, what challenge should investors consider before doing that?
Yeah, so we have 6 assets in the UK, 4 operating and 2 in construction. 1 we have submitted into the track 1 expansion phase, which is just closed. So that's projects seeking to connect to the HyNet cluster in the northwest of the UK. So we have made 1 application, but as you say, there's 5 other projects in our portfolio that we want to connect to CCS. And we're pragmatic that when we look forward, the UK government is clear that it wants to create a self-sustaining CCS market. So our operating basis is not that we will be able to get UK government support contracts for all 6 of those facilities. The UK government has done a lot of work with investors on those initial business models, as Olivia alluded to, 10-year CFD type instruments. So I think we are confident that for those initial subsidized projects, investors will support those projects and those projects will be investable. But when we think about the more merchant solution, as you alluded to, again, this goes back to our USP is we have biogenic and fossil CO2. So hopefully that biogenic element will become increasingly important as a carbon removal credit. And as large corporates move away from traditional offsetting to durable, high quality, high integrity carbon removal credits, those credits should be increasingly attractive to potential purchasers. So that's our vision in terms of how we make the projects investable. What do we need for that to happen? One, we probably need the voluntary carbon market to continue to scale up as it has been doing over the last few years. Alternatively, the UK government has signalled it's minded to bring carbon removals into the UK emissions trading scheme. So the ETS in the UK becomes the compliance scheme for greenhouse gas removal, carbon removal credits as well. So we think that is something that could be game-changing in terms of bringing new liquidity and bringing purchasers to the table, while also having the benefit of that cost no longer falling on general taxation or consumers, but actually being something that emitters within the ETS are paying for rather than the general public.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. And I think you introduced a lot of topics, so I would like to bring Carl and Olivia back in. So maybe I think one of the key challenges, right, is this creating a self-sustaining market where more investment can come on and not only supported by government subsidies. And what comes partly from your comment is, the cost of removals, the cost of carbon credit, of carbon emissions. And also in the report, we try to highlight how carbon markets should be playing a much bigger role on this. And yes, I would like to maybe start with Olivia. What do you think? What else is needed to create this more self-sustaining market for CCUS?
I mean, I think we looked at this in our modelling for our spring budget submission. So in terms of a self-sustaining market, we need a stable and sufficiently high carbon price to drive investment, but also looking at the role that a low carbon products market will play in terms of driving the demand for those types of products. And obviously that will need to come alongside a CBAM. So there is potential, I think, if once these mechanisms are in place, and potentially looking as well at storage obligations, then we can start to have a self-sustaining market that will help to pay for itself. Oh, you're on mute, Lorenzo.
Sorry, it always happens. So yes, Carl Greenfield, would you like to also add up something on this, maybe also, from a more global perspective?
Sure. I think I'd also just add that the energy sector is full of subsidies. Whether we're talking about a 20 billion euro or pound grant, or whether we're talking about hidden subsidies throughout the entire system. So I think the way you're framing it in terms of like a sustainable self-driving market, I think that's the right way to think about, because inevitably there's going to be subsidies in different parts of the energy system. But as we look towards a net zero future, what we want to do is take a look at the sectors that need a little bit more help. And this is where the government can step in. So you mentioned this, Lorenzo, at the beginning. It's really supporting a lot of the first of a kind projects. And so this is where I think you'll continue to see some government subsidization within, just to get the initial projects off the ground. But this is only like talking about the capture side. There's still the transport and storage aspect. And in the UK, they're kind of taking the very heavily regulated approach towards that transportation and storage infrastructure. Commercially, it's hard for private investors to private developers to take on this risk initially. And so the government in this case is stepping in. You're seeing different models develop in different parts of the world. But I think having the policies to drive long-term growth, I think you hit it, a higher, more stable carbon price, that can definitely do it. Increase government coordination, so it doesn't have to necessarily be money going towards projects, but again, coordinating, making sure that the networks are in place, as well as the technical specifications to handle different types, concentrations of CO2, and making sure that the pipelines are there, the ships are there, and the storage is assessed and developed in a timely manner, and making sure that these networks can expand to emitters that are more dispersed. So cement plants, for example, they tend not to be within these clusters. So I think those are really some of the levers that can drive this longer term growth.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is very interesting. And maybe my next follow-up, also starting to pick up from the Q&A box and try to summarize. There are many questions there, so I'm sorry we won't be able to cover everything, but I'll try to do some thematic questions that cover most of the main themes that I see there. So one there, I think, is between the challenge between the capture projects and then transport and storage infrastructure. And also from my experience, in my previous report was looking at grid infrastructure, how we've invested a lot in solar and wind, but not enough in the grid, so to move stuff around. And it's also because building infrastructure like pipelines and storage sites in this case takes much longer than building the capture plants. So how do you think we can get around this chicken egg problem, and what are the main challenges in terms of timeline? And I don't know, should we oversize all the storage sites and hope that everything comes in, or the other way around? And what are the main risks in your view? And I don't know, wants to start, maybe Carl, I know you have to drop quite soon.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo. I mean, I think you described it as chicken and egg, which I think is a good analogy, because as an emitter today, we could build a carbon capture technology in 3 to 4 years, but we need the transport and storage infrastructure to sit alongside that. So it is critical, whether you're doing a subsidized project from a national support scheme or you're trying to do a merchant-based model, you still need the infrastructure. So I think that is a common thread that cuts across both a merchant-based and a subsidized solution. If you look at what has happened in the UK, the industrial cluster approach has been, I think, quite a sensible strategic approach, which is invest private capital and public capital in developing the initial infrastructure at industrial clusters where there is a concentrated group of emitters, and use that initial public investment to try and establish the infrastructure for others to connect in going forward. So I think that is a good and useful approach. But in parallel, you, of course, need a solution for, in the UK's case, the 50% of emissions that's not near an industrial cluster, where non-transport solutions are more important. So I do think, going back to Olivia's point earlier, I think there will continue to be the need for UK government or national government support in these initial phases of deployment as we establish the principle and look to create new and innovative ways to transport CO2 via rail or via shipping, on the basis that there will be a point at which member states step away. But I think that is a medium to long-term ambition rather than something that can happen on a purely merchant basis overnight.
And I would say that the UK government, they published their CCUS vision just before Christmas, and so this is starting to set out how we move that way. So obviously, and I think Carl already mentioned how it can take 5 to 7 years to bring CO2 storage into line. So we've got long lead-in times where we need to be making progress in those areas. But to do that, they need some certainty that there will be people who want to store their CO2 and a way to pay for that. So that's what the vision is looking at, how we move through those phases to get there. And the CCSA is modeled that with a clear forward allocation framework and funding attached to that, and that funding doesn't start, it's not drawn down on until those projects are operational. So we're talking late 2020s, then we can we start to see costs and the demands on that funding to start to reduce from the early 2030s onwards. But all of that is similar to what Carl was saying. We need to know that that those stores will be able to, that there will be low carbon products, and there will be a demand for those, and they'll be able to be sold, and there'll be a negative emissions market. But opening up that storage market and having both the UK domestic emissions and also merchant emissions potentially from EU member states also being able to store in those stores. And I think once that demand is there, then the storage market will really be able to move forward and expand at scale. And the quicker we do that, the quicker we see the cost curves coming down.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And Carl, is there something you want to add? Or
yeah, I think for the UK is special in the sense that it has a large existing oil and gas industry that has a lot of subsurface expertise and data, and so they've mapped a lot of storage potential, and so the development of these storage sites actually would be less than in other regions in the world, to where you don't have a lot of this information. You have general idea of where you could store the CO2, but you haven't conducted necessarily the detailed assessments of where that CO2 and how that CO2 could actually behave once it is stored. Yeah, but I think Olivia hit the nail on the head. It's you need to do these two things in parallel, and the public sector is fairly well placed to do this and to help coordinate this. You're seeing in Alberta and Canada, so at the provincial level, they're working on oversizing their transport infrastructure, and so they're creating what's called a trunk line, big pipeline going through large industrial emitters, in the hope that one day these emitters will connect to a larger pipeline. And so I think it's, you'll see different business models start to develop in different parts of the world, depending on how the industry is structured, where the industry is located, as well as the sort of economic incentive structures of that country. But regardless, these things need to happen in parallel as you're talking about where to capture the emissions, and what sectors and what alternatives to do so.
And there are provisions already within the regulatory regime, the UK regime, that it's oversized at the beginning to allow for projects to connect. So that's there, and that's part of how the whole business model has been structured in terms of the whole regulatory model, to enable that recognition that we've got to build the infrastructure first, and then and those projects will be ready, but trying to align that as far as possible to make it as efficient as possible.
Yes, thanks so much. And I think it opens a very big question on the complexity of the role that the regulator has to play in coordinating everything, taking some risk beforehand, and yes, hopeful. And also, I guess, also the storage sites is always quite complex, and there are a lot of geological exploration that comes online that takes a lot of time. It's very costly. It's out of sunk costs. So it's all a lot of complexity that adds up, but someone has to take care of that, I think.
Complexity, but as Carl said, where we have expertise and knowledge in this area. Yeah,
absolutely. Very good. And I know we've just got 5 minutes, but it's not easy to introduce this topic now. But I think we need to cover it a little bit. So the question of costs. So in my analysis, and let's say costs and capture rates together. So in my analysis, what I found is that there is, at least so far, very little sign of learning rates for carbon capture projects in the terms of costs. So there are significant thermodynamic limitations in the complexity of extracting CO2, either from flue gases or the air or whatever else. And also, as you also introduced now, a lot of projects require quite a lot of customized, tailored engineering, be it for the storage side, be it for the specifics that every emission project maybe is a little bit different than the other. So in your view, how much can we actually see cost improvements both on the capture side and on the storage side? And maybe, Olivia, do you want to start?
I think, as we are, there are projects that are now already operating, but as Carl said, we're expecting a huge number to move from being announced to actually being deployed, and then we'll start to see how those can really operate at scale, and some of those cost reductions to come forward. I think a lot of the cost reductions will come forward in terms of the efficiency of the process and how we can work there as and in terms of and also there are differences, I think, between retrofit and new build in terms of how those types of costs and the technology can be rolled out there. But as the industry continues to develop and evolve, there will definitely be learnings across from each of them. And of course, I think initial projects are going to be more expensive at this stage, and we will see those, as as costs start to reduce as it's deployed at scale. But I think there is an awful lot of efficiency in terms of how the infrastructure is designed and acted that will also help to drive down costs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge with such a small data set right now, with only 50 million tons of CO2 being captured. And honestly, the CO2 that's being captured today, most of that capacity has not been driven by a need to reach net zero, if we're being honest, because we've been doing CCUS with EOR for decades, 50 years, and we've only been storing it in dedicated storage sites since the 90s. And really only those 2 projects in Norway have been driven by some environmental regulations. But for the most part, the drivers behind the projects in operation to date haven't necessarily been for climate purposes and driving towards net zero. It partly explains why we see such a massive momentum in the last couple of years, because the world, more or less as a whole, has started to align with the net zero future, or at least planning to align with the net zero future. So I think it's hard to then look at where we could see costs decline based off the projects that we've seen in operation today. Because if we're talking about different capture rates, maybe let's just say from the plant level, the policies that have been in place today to capture CO2 have been ones to incentivize the lowest hanging fruits. So the tax credits in the US, you have a lot of capture on natural gas processing, because that's inherent. Separating the CO2 is inherent to that process. Relatively low capture rates, because all they need to do is capture the CO2 to get the tax credit, without sort of a greater incentive for creating climate benefits from that. And so I think as you'll see more and more projects come into operation, you might see higher overall plant level capture rates, because there's more of a driver to reach net zero. So in the past, if you're only capturing 40%, 50% of the total plant emissions, you're capturing from maybe one stream. You get enough money from tax credits or grants or whatever to cover your costs. But overall, if you talk about a plant level decarbonization, you need to deploy capture facilities at different parts of the plant, thus increasing the overall plant capture rate. That becomes a little bit more costly, but that increases the overall climate benefit of the whole system. So I think going forward, it's important to look at the drivers of what these projects are, kind of the drivers behind these projects. That can really tell you, the future levels of what we potentially could be looking at in terms of capture rate, in terms of costs. You look at Boundary Dam in Canada, you look at Petronova in the US, which had its own issues, but it's now back up and running. So big cost decreases from that. That's just 2 plants. And so hopefully, analysis in 2025, 2028, we could have a much clearer picture of where we could see costs declining. But yeah, it's a huge challenge just to try to project that out with the 50 million tons we see.
Yes, indeed. And I'm sorry, we're getting very close to the hour, so I need to close the discussion now, but thanks both. I think we managed to raise a lot of points on the importance of strong policy and governance for CCUS projects. I think your last points, Carl, were very interesting on bringing out what's the motivation of the projects that we had up to date now and what we need. So projects need to be focused on net zero, abating emissions as much as possible. And in my view, we should try to focus as much as possible on those sectors where we have very low alternatives and where we can deliver the higher value for an energy system level. And we all hope that the CCUS industry could play a very important role in abating emissions, because eventually I think what this debate a little bit brings together is that we're all working on the same objective, towards the same direction. So let's hope to get there. And again, Carl, Olivia, and Carl Smith unfortunately had to drop because of another meeting. I want to really thank you for your time, and you have busy schedules, but I really thank you for coming here and sharing your opinion and debating the report's finding with me. I also want to thank Hannah, Simon, and all the comms team that helped me bring the webinar together. And the audience, we've seen a lot of interest in this report and this webinar. We've had almost 300 live attendees throughout the stream. So thank you to everyone who joined, and I hope we helped you clarify your opinions on CCUS and its role towards net zero. So thank you, everyone. Stay tuned for our upcoming research, and see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much.